Welcome to the Junto Podcast. My name is Brett McNeil. Today is Wednesday, June 5th.
And I'm Dan Van Gordon.
I'd like to welcome Ken Feinberg. This is the Junto Podcast. If you're not familiar, you should be. Ken Feinberg is one of the leading mediators in the United States. Whenever tragedy happens in the country, people turn to Ken for wisdom and help. With things like the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, Boston Marathon shooting, or even most recently Roundup, Ken has been there. Ken, pleasure to have you on.
Glad to be on. Thank you.
All right, so Ken, I was kind of looking at your resume and how you've been all over the United States, and it kind of occurred to me you're kind of like the Forrest Gump of modern history. You kind of show up when tragedy happens. You've almost touched every single major event that I can think of in my lifetime. So I think maybe we should start out with, 9/11 and how you got into mediation and, stuff like that.
Well, I got involved in mediation about 15 or 16 years before 9/11. When the Vietnam veterans came home from Vietnam, they filed a class action lawsuit asserting that their various illnesses were caused by exposure to Agent Orange, the Air Force defoliant, the herbicide which was dropped as part of the war in Vietnam, and the Vietnam veterans claimed that they were exposed to it, and the chemical dioxin, and as a result suffered various maladies, various injuries. The judge who had that case in Brooklyn called me. I knew him well. We had both worked together at different times for the chief judge of New York State. And he asked me, would I come and mediate a settlement, try and get a settlement between the class of Vietnam veterans, 250,000 of them, and the chemical companies, Dow and Monsanto and others, that had manufactured Agent Orange. And I said I would, and in 8 weeks, that case was resolved for $250 million. And after I mediated that case, my first case, people started calling me, companies started calling me from all over the United States to do their cases, their disputes, and that was the transformative event in my career. In 2001, the Bush administration, Attorney General John Ashcroft, called me and asked if I would serve as the 9/11 victim compensation special master, as it was called in the legislation. And I did that, and so the cases come my way.
Okay. And I remember hearing from another interview, you're pretty good friends with John Kerry. Is that correct?
Yes, John Kerry is was the senator from New York.
Correct.
And I got to know John Kerry when I was working for Senator Kennedy.
Okay. Wow.
And John Kerry was the junior senator from Massachusetts. And I got to know him fairly well, and I've known John over the years when he was Secretary of State in the Obama administration, and worked with him.
Do you guys still keep in contact today?
We do. As a matter of fact, I met him within the last week at an airport in Martha's Vineyard. We were both leaving the Vineyard to go back to Boston and then Washington, and we met at the airport.
Very cool.
So I had read recently that you were appointed to a new position within the government. Is that correct, Brett?
Well, it wasn't recently. It was in the Obama administration.
Oh, it was? Okay.
I guess let me just say, it was in the Obama administration that I was appointed at the Treasury Department. They needed somebody, a special assignment. And in the Trump administration, I was appointed the special master to handle the state-sponsored terrorism fund. There's a new fund that's been created by Congress to compensate the victims of state-sponsored terrorism, like the Iranian hostages, or those victims of the African bombings in the late 1990s, attributable to Iran and to the Sudan. And there's a fund, and I administered that fund as well.
Sure. Now, everybody remembers where they were on 9/11. Ken, where were you?
I was walking out of a class that I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
Okay.
And I saw on the Student Union TV there that the first plane had hit the World Trade Center.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was very strange. And then on the way to the 30th Street station, the railroad station in Philadelphia, the second plane hit. And then you knew there was real problems, a terrorist attack. I got on the train in Philadelphia to come back to Washington. I got as far as Wilmington, Delaware. And then the third plane hit in the Pentagon, and all rail traffic stopped, and I had to hire a taxi to take me back to Washington.
So at the time of 9/11, did it change your entire perspective of what you do?
It certainly did. Not so much 9/11, although that certainly changed my perspective in terms of Americans being safe.
Mm-hmm.
Agent Orange changed my professional perspective. It was after Agent Orange and that settlement that I did a 90-degree turn in terms of what I would do as a lawyer and what my areas of specialty would be.
Right. Now, Ken, I was listening to a previous interview, and you said something that really kind of struck a chord with me. You had said that what people want more than anything than monetary compensation is to be remembered. Is that correct?
What they want is certainty.
Okay.
What they want is certainty. The trouble with our legal system is you're rolling the dice. Judges, juries, you're not sure what they'll do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the programs that I administer, there's certainty. There's the knowledge that if you apply and you're eligible under one of these programs like 9/11, you will be compensated, and you will be compensated at X level. And you know that probably within about 90 days of submitting your claim. And that's the type of certainty that most victims don't have.
Yeah.
In their lives, never mind in the legal system. They've been the victims of unanticipated tragedy and loss, and they are, they're unstable. Their lives are unstable. And a program like mine, like the 9/11 Fund or the BP oil spill fund or the Boston Marathon or Virginia Tech, the compensation fund after the shootings, gives people a little bit more control over their lives, or at least over the financial aspect of their lives. And that's a real advantage under these programs.
Do you feel that as a mediator that the consolement and the emotions are difficult to manage, or are you able to still do your job and compartmentalize that? I mean, has there been any gut-wrenching or heart-wrenching moments with a particular victim that you've had to go through with any of these funds?
Well, you've zeroed in on the most difficult aspect of what I do. It's not calculating damages or awarding compensation. The most difficult part of what I do is the emotion, the emotional constraints that you confront, first from the victim after victim after victim with very emotional, heart-wrenching stories. And then it builds up, and it's very, very debilitating personally. You can't help but be effective. You say, can you cabinize it, or can you, corral that type of thing? No, you can't.
Well, I remember you talking...
It's very tough.
Sorry, I remember you talking about grief and people being overcome by it, and one particular, was it a mother that was overcome by grief, and you would even went to her door to give her paperwork so that she could receive part of the settlement.
That's right. There were two people. There were two people out of 7,300 people who applied. There were only two individuals in the 9/11 Fund who were so debilitated, so paralyzed by grief at the loss of a loved one that they couldn't even fill out the paperwork to receive millions of dollars. And the fund expired by statute, and two people including this 80-year-old woman who lost her son, simply never applied. They never sued instead. They did nothing. Nothing. And you learn a lot about grief when you do what I do. You learn that grief can indeed paralyze people, prevent them from acting reasonably. And those two examples I'll never forget in the 9/11 Fund.
Do you think that economically, like, in economics, we talk about incentives and it's hyper-rational. Is there almost a totally different rational mindset or decision-making when people are grief-stricken that you've noticed?
Yes. Under our system of judges, courts, juries, when somebody is an innocent victim of tragedy and they receive compensation, it is economic loss. What would the victim have earned over a work life but for the tragedy? Add something for pain and suffering equals the award. And I find that part of what I do, the calculation of individual damage, that's not hard. I think millions of people could do that in this country. Juries do it every day in every village and town and hamlet and city in this country. Nope, the real tough part, the agonizing part, is the emotion. And when you take on one of the assignments, whenever I take on one, I brace myself for what I'm going to hear.
Well, let's fast forward a bit now to Roundup. Can you go into any detail on what's going on there?
No, it's just started. I'm reading in the newspapers. I don't know any more than you do. I've been asked by the court. To try and resolve the hundreds of cases, thousands if you include state courts as well. And I've reached out at the court's request. I've talked to the plaintiff lawyers representing the victims, and I've talked to the company representatives of Bayer and Monsanto, and I'm just now trying to fashion some process for going forward to see if we can resolve matters.
Do you think, that we're going to start seeing more cases like the Roundup case in the future?
Oh, I don't know. It's a murky crystal ball. I suppose it's the American system.
Yeah.
And in the tort world, the courts haven't looked too favorably on aggregating mass claims involving personal injury. But they may, and we'll see what happens, what unfolds over the next few months.
Ken, what do you see as tort reform? We always hear about tort reform. Is there anything that you might be able to elaborate on?
I can tell you this. People who call for tort reform, I'm reminded of the 19th century historian Macaulay. He was asked about parliamentary reform in England. And he said, reform, sir, reform. Don't talk to me about reform. We're in enough trouble already. I think it is highly unlikely that you'll see any real substantive tort reform. The tort system, the trial system in our country is so ingrained in the history and the fabric of America, our heritage, that I think the idea that we're going to start tinkering with the way we resolve tort claims, I think is tilting at windmills. I don't think you'll see it, and I don't think you should see it, frankly. I think the American tort system and the trial system, it works pretty well in most cases.
I know a lot of people that call for tort reform usually kind of do it as a pedestal to lean on if they don't really have any other good ideas. That's kind of something I've noticed when a lot of politicians do say that. And I don't know if you think that's true, but I think it's just a word that gets thrown around a lot more.
I think that most people who advocate for tort reform don't have any real belief that it will happen. You know, every day in our country, thousands of lawsuits are resolved in our courts, in the tort system. It's the roundups or the large water pollution cases or these huge cases, Vioxx and Celebrex, huge cases involving thousands and thousands of victims and users where the tort system really has trouble. handling mass claims, as opposed to the individual who gets hit by a car or falls off a ladder. The tort system works. It may not work as efficiently as it should in mass claims, but in the normal run of things, I think the system works pretty well.
I would agree with that, Ken. Ken, you've done a lot to help people. Can you tell me what your proudest accomplishment in life is?
Oh, I think that's easy. The proudest accomplishment in life has nothing to do with mediation or professional achievement. It's raising very well, I think, 3 children and now 4 granddaughters.
Oh, boy.
Who live in New York City. And that's my proudest achievement. I think that the next Feinberg generation, it'll be their turn pretty soon. And let them go forward. And I think my wife and I have sort of raised them the right way, and I think they're doing well.
Ken, I have to tell you, I have 3 children as well.
So you know.
Yeah, are yours?
You know the pride. You know the pride and the work. You never stop. You're gonna learn this. You never stop being a father.
No.
You never stop being a mother. That's the way it is. That's part of the human drama that plays out. You're always going to be called on.
Now, do you have sons or daughters or both?
I have 2 sons and a daughter in between, and I have 4 granddaughters, 2 by each of my boys.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that being a father is a proud achievement. I actually adopted mine, but it's just a constant challenge in today's world. I also kind of wanted to ask you about something, and I was actually talking with a lawyer the other day about this, and he had a daughter, graduated from Harvard with her MBA. We were talking about how law school has changed and how being a lawyer has changed. Do you feel that, being a lawyer has changed?
Oh, I think being a lawyer hasn't changed. I think going to law school has changed. And I think there are too many lawyers coming out of law school factories, ill-prepared. There aren't enough jobs for lawyers, premium jobs. I know lawyers driving taxis. And I try and discourage young people from going to law school unless they really want to be a lawyer. A lot of individuals go to law school because they're not sure what they want to do professionally. And they figure that a law degree gives them some options to go into business, study law, do what you want. I discourage individual graduates from going to law school for that reason. If you're not sure what you want to do, then, you want to go to business school or you want to get a master's degree in something, that's one thing. But investing the time and money just to go to law school to think about what you want to do next, I think that's money not well spent.
I think you pretty much struck a chord. And I only asked you that because I had once debated, becoming a lawyer, and then you look at the fees and you're like, well, if you think it's really worth it. But another thing I had noticed when looking at law schools is I don't know if maybe it's particularly in the Midwest, but mediation and arbitration seems to be on the rise in terms of being a field of law. A lot of people seem to be going into it. I mean, would you agree with that?
I would agree that mediation's on the rise, but I must say, I hear every once in a while people say that it's the wave of the future. I don't believe that for a second. I think the American legal system and the adversary system and the trial system is here to stay. It's not going to be replaced. I don't think mediation or arbitration will ever overtake our legal system. It is a niche field. It is a narrow field. And I think it should be encouraged. I promote it, of course, but I lower expectations if people think it's the wave of the future. I don't.
All right, Ken, I got a question for you. How do you feel about student loan debt?
I think that there has to be some type of federal or state government program to alleviate and diminish the debt burden on individual young people who otherwise, without loans or scholarships or whatever, wouldn't have had a chance to go to school. And I think it's in our interest in this country to come up with a cost-effective way to help minimize that debt so that individuals can start out in their profession without being saddled too much, thereby restricting their flexibility when it comes to jobs.
I also think, and Brett asked a really good question, with student loan debt, I think it's actually hindering the economy because, you have a lot of young people that come out of school and, obviously, people go into degree programs. They might not go for quote unquote a useful degree, as a lot of people call it, but they still went to school. They did what was expected of them. But, they get out and they can't buy a house. They can't start a business. They can't have children. I think it hinders everyone. And I think a lot of people don't think about that.
I hear that a lot. I read the newspapers. My kids no longer have that burden. But you worry about your grandkids. You worry about others. And I hear that all the time, that the drag on the ability to choose a course of action in the public interest or what have you after law school or any other job, when you've got that debt that's sort of hampering your ability, your flexibility to choose the right job that'll bring you personal fulfillment.
I also wanted to kind of ask you, and this kind of came to my mind. Now, obviously, you've worked a lot of victims, and I don't know if you've worked with this particular case. I mean, I didn't see it on the various lists, but what do you think about the Catholic Church's, abuse victim cases that seem to be handled in mediation quite often? A lot of former, well, actually, you never really stopped being a victim, but a lot of victims of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church seem to go through mediation quite often. I was wondering what your opinion on that was.
I am heavily involved in that right now. I've been retained by the church in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and California to resolve individual minor victims of Catholic Church abuse. And this has been going on for over a year. I've paid out to date somewhere around $300 million.
Wow.
And the effort is expanding, and it's become an important part of my professional day. Fortunately, a woman who's been working with me for over 40 years, Camille Biros, B-I-R-O-S, she is here in my office, and she's been handling virtually that entire church abuse problem involving hundreds of priests and thousands of victims.
Now, a lot of these victims, perhaps they leave the church and remain silent. How is the church possibly reaching out to these victims that might not have been heard so that people like you can help them?
Well, first of all, the church tries to do that by delegating to me, an independent secular administrator, to reach out to people and try and get them to apply for compensation based on the fact that the church won't be reviewing the claim. I will. And we've made strides and taken steps to try and make sure that we reach out to all citizens, those who filed a claim years ago and those who haven't, in order to let them know that there's an independent, secular individual named Feinberg and Biros who will process your claim and pay you the money, and you don't have to deal directly with the church whatsoever.
Well, I'm glad to hear that these people are getting the help that they need now. Ken, when the BP oil spill happened, the aftermath of it, you know, I don't think I ever really heard enough. Can you tell me really what the ultimate conclusion to that was?
In 16 months after the BP oil spill, I was asked by BP to set up an independent claims program where I would have full authority and independence to resolve any individual claim. In 16 months, I received 1,200,000 claims from individuals and businesses in 50 states. I got claims from Minnesota. I didn't know the oil had got to Minnesota. I received claims from 50 states, 1,200,000 of them. I found I paid out in 16 months $6.5 billion.
Oh my God.
And secured about 250,000 individual releases from businesses and individuals. I compensated in the BP oil spill. I compensated 92% of all the victims of that spill, and a real success.
Where does all that money come from? Does it come from insurance? Does it come from cash reserves that companies might have on hand? I'm just curious.
You're asking me whether BP, an international oil company, had the ability to pay. I don't know where the money came from, and frankly, I don't care. All I know is that $6.5 billion was requested, and $6.5 billion was paid, and that to me is all that's important in that score.
Do a lot of these companies fight you, or do they work with you, or is it
they work with me?
They do work with you.
They work with me.
Yeah.
GM worked with me. BP worked with me. The federal government in 9/11 worked with me. The church works with me. No. This is a mutual decision when victims and perpetrators both come to me and ask for my help in designing, administering the program, and that's what I do.
Well, I remember you talking about the airliners went right to Congress after 9/11 to make sure that they wouldn't be held liable. Do you see a lot of the companies going to Congress after,
No. Now remember, the airlines ran to Congress after the terrorist attacks, not because of anything they did.
Right.
Although there were allegations, there were certainly allegations that the airlines were negligent in not preventing the attacks, that's for sure. But the airlines went to the Congress and said, we want help in keeping us out of the courts. And Congress set up this very generous, voluntary program, purely voluntary, to compensate victims, and the taxpayer paid. And I paid out in 9/11 in 33 months $7.1 billion. And I paid that to 5,300 people, dead and injured. And the program worked. You'll never see it again. You'll never see a 9/11 fund again. But at the time, it was the right thing to do, and it worked.
And Ken, the right thing to do indeed. You didn't take a penny for any of this, did you?
Didn't take a penny from who?
From any of these cases.
Oh, of course you couldn't. That was patriotism. I was asked to do this job. I did it pro bono. I didn't seek any compensation. I don't think compensation in 9/11 would have been appropriate. And I was glad to do it as an American citizen.
I think having a reputation is probably more valuable than a check.
Well, it certainly was in that case. I think it certainly helped people recognizing the bona fides and legitimacy of the program. Feinberg's not making any money on this. He's doing the right thing. I think that helped engender great support for the program. 97% of all the families that lost a loved one on 9/11 came into the fund.
How did you guys logistically reach all of these victims? How does one do that? How do you find them? How do you recognize them? How do you identify them?
That's not hard. In 9/11, all you have to do is pick up a newspaper. You've got the airline manifests. You know who was on the airline in the 4 airplanes. You've got death certificates from the city of New York. You've got military death records from the Pentagon. So you have a traumatic disaster where it's relatively easy to categorize death claims and physical injury claims. And when you have traumatic accidents, gunshot wounds, deaths, a traumatic explosion like the Boston Marathon or the 9/11 bombings or the Pulse nightclub shootings in Orlando or the Boston Marathon bombings, the Sandy Hook Elementary School, first graders, it's not hard to make sure that you've covered the group of victims, and that's not hard. It gets tougher when you've got, chemical exposures, Roundup, or asbestos, or Celebrex, or some Vioxx, some allegations of chemical industry injury, and there you've got to have proof requirements and medical records, etc., to try and do it that way.
Well, Ken, I remember you talking about one of your proudest accomplishments in the Boston Marathon was bridging that compensation gap. Can you talk about that?
The Boston Marathon was an amazing example of public charitable generosity. After the marathon bombings, 4 dead and about 140 physically injured, severed limbs and other injuries, Mayor Menino and Governor Patrick of Massachusetts, Mayor Menino of Boston, announced that they were going to set up a special fund in Boston, One Fund Boston, to receive voluntary contributions from businesses and individuals around the country. Well, in about 90 days, $61 million came into the fund. And that money was quickly distributed. They asked me to do that.
And that was all done through charity, correct?
That's all charity. It's all private individuals and businesses. You learn, never underestimate the charitable impulse of the American people. It's astounding. It's astounding. 100,000 people contributed to the Boston One Fund Boston, and we distributed the money to the dead, 4 dead, and about 140 physically injured, some with both limbs severed, 16 amputations involving one limb, and very, very difficult, but we got it done.
That's really, hearing that story almost makes me feel patriotic inside. And I am very proud of this country and how we are one of the most charitable peoples, around. And I think that's something to really be proud of. So that really gives me hope for humanity. And I hope it gives you hope for humanity when you do this work, when you see how many people contribute money or time or...
One Orlando after the Pulse nightclub shootings, $31 million. The Harvest concert in Las Vegas, $30 million. The Virginia Tech shootings, $8 million. Aurora, Colorado, the Dark Knight movie shootings, $5 million. The Sandy Hook first graders in Newtown, Connecticut, again, something like $10 million. It's just an amazing thing how, when a tragedy occurs in the United States, private donations constantly make up the corpus that's used to distribute to the victims. It's fabulous.
Ken, do any of these victims remain in contact with you afterwards?
No.
No?
Absolutely not. I go out of my way to make sure that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. They have to move on as best they can.
Right.
They've received a check. Good luck. Good luck. I wish you well. Goodbye. No reunions, no contact. And in 9/11, every year after 9/11, for about 10 years, I received a box of candy on the 9/11 anniversary from one of the victims. And he or she never gave me the name, and he or she must have died or moved away or whatever, because the last 3 or 4 years I don't get it anymore. I don't receive that candy. But for 10 years I did.
Wow.
That's really, do you draw that line because is there like a professional reason to draw that line if people become somewhat too involved?
Oh, I think it's very important that any administrator who does what I do, distance yourself from the day-to-day post-settlement activity or conduct of an individual. You get the money out to them, they sign a release, I will not sue, that's the end of it. You don't want to be thrust into their daily lives when they're trying to move on, etc. So we avoid that.
And obviously with all this work, do you ever look back on it all and and kind of think on how impactful you've been on kind of recent American history?
No, you try not to do that. Now, I must say, the 9/11 fund, where I distributed over $7 billion of taxpayer money, had an impact on people. I'm sure they got some degree of financial certainty. I'm not sure they wouldn't have gladly given up all of that money to have their loved one back, I'll tell you that. But you'll never see the 9/11 fund again. The idea that the public taxpayer should compensate innocent victims. Bad things happen to good people every day in this country. Mm-hmm. You don't have a 9/11 fund. I didn't see any 9/11 fund after Hurricane Katrina. Over 1,000 people died in that flood down in New Orleans. There was no 9/11 fund. I think you better be careful about talking about the 9/11 fund as if it's a precedent. I think it's a precedent for nothing, and I don't think you'll see it again. And I don't think you should see it again.
I don't think you will either. Ken, all the cases that you've done, have you ever added up all the monetary awards given out?
No, but I'm sure it's well over $20 billion, I'll tell you that. 9/11 and BP alone is almost $14 billion. There are, many others, so.
So have you ever basically have you ever worked outside of the United States on any victims' cases, or are all of your cases in the United States?
No, all in the United States, because only the United States has the unique court system that is often used in contrast to what companies or the federal government ask me to do. In foreign countries, you don't have tort liability and the adversary trial system. You don't have the problem. Mm-hmm. I went over to England after a terrorist attack there about 10 years ago, and they were all very interested till I told them that the average award in the American legal system in 9/11 that I gave out was about $2 million per claim. Well, that was the end of that. I was on the next plane back to the United States. They hear numbers like that, and they don't understand. They can't fathom the way the American legal system works. So,
Ken, with social media becoming, I guess, so prevalent now, where do you see that role fitting in our culture?
Oh, I think that has a prominent role to play. I think it has a prominent role to play up front in terms of spreading the news instantaneously about tragedy and victims and financial need and wherewithal, and that engenders a tremendous outpouring by the American people, courtesy of social media. And I think the programs that I design and administer receive praise and criticism as a result of social media. Mm-hmm. I think social media, like in so many areas of our lives today, when it comes to the work that I do, social media is a very important, informative source of outreach as to what's good and bad in these programs that I administer.
Now, obviously with social media comes disinformation. Have you seen fake campaigns pop up where money is poured into?
No.
No?
No. If you're asking, do these programs, Ken, that you've been involved in over the last 15 years, do you see a fair amount of fraud in the design and administration of these programs? No, I do not. Certainly in the programs I've designed and administered.
Well, maybe not through you.
No, I don't think I see much of that. Now, maybe it's on there and it's a problem, but I don't see it. I don't witness it, and I'd be surprised. I think the American people basically, out of the goodness of their heart, provide that money to the victims.
And I was going to ask you, you said you received criticism on social media. To me, it's like hard to picture like who would criticize you on social media. Can you give us an example of why they would criticize you?
Oh my goodness, there's a litany. why they would criticize me. They would criticize me all the way. I've heard it over the years. This program is lawless. You've delegated all this authority to one man instead of the courts. That's bad constitutional law. It's not a good idea. That's one criticism. Too much delegation to me. Secondly, you hear criticism that the victims are compelled to take the money. They're in grief. You dangle money in front of them. That's economic compulsion. If they really were reasonable and thought a little bit about it, they wouldn't come into the program. They would file a lawsuit instead. You get personal criticism that you're coarse, that you're belligerent, that you're not empathetic enough, and you hear that. You get criticism that Feinberg's being inconsistent and biased. He pays some claims and he doesn't pay others, and he's not applying the protocol and the rules fairly. Oh my goodness, you get all sorts of criticism from all types of people, and you can't help but be affected by it, but you have to do the right thing. You have to do what you've been asked to do and weather that criticism, and that's what I do.
Well, Ken, I remember you talking about in the beginning approaching things from maybe more legalese terms, but you had found that a more empathetic approach was helpful?
I think that's right. I found that the more you can exhibit empathy, the better. I'm not sure a law degree is particularly useful for what I do. Maybe a divinity degree or a degree in psychiatry would be better. You're dealing with very vulnerable people who have been innocently, their lives have been wrecked. And empathy and hand-holding and sensitivity are a lot more important than legal competence or adversarial advocacy or what have you.
Well, and that's a very interesting point. You say you need a degree in divinity to be what you're doing. I found it kind of funny because it kind of reminds me of a Catholic priest in confession. We really enjoyed the interview. I think you have to be somewhere soon.
That's correct. I'm glad. But I would like to know, you guys, you sound like you're starting out something quite interesting. When did Juno start, and how long have you been tinkering with the model that you're using?
So the Junto Podcast Club started, it was an idea that Brett and I had in college, and we were frustrated with the charged rhetoric of basically the American media and kind of just the American public in general. So we decided to make a forum in which people could hear a conversation, which isn't often had, without flags or tribalism involved. And this was kind of our idea of bringing the world together, but also doing something we loved. So,
and when did you start it?
Well, we started working on it in spring, and we do plan on launching our first season in the summer. So,
well, good for you. So this is one of the first interviews that you've had.
Second interview, yeah. Interview number 2. So, and then
all right, I'm in a very select company then.
You are.
The elites.
Well, good luck. Good luck to you guys. I hope it works. I think anything you can do to advance the notion of, in the public interest, informing people about some of these key issues in the American life, I think is a very, very good thing. And I'm glad I could help you out a little bit, and I hope it works. And I wish you guys great success.
Ken, we couldn't be happier to have had you on. Things aren't always black and white, and we could tell from that from this conversation that is very much so the case. But thank you again, Ken, for being on.
Glad to do it, guys. Good luck to you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that will conclude the Junto Podcast Club, Season 1, Episode 2. Catch next week with Brett and I. We are going to interview Charles Mann next. So we bid you adieu, Brett.
We bid you a farewell.